Hello and welcome back to this series of videos on learning support for autistic children and young people. And thank you for visiting the North Somerset Educational Psychology Service Training Library. Today we're going to look at some practical top tips for learning support, and in particular we're going to focus on how we can create autism-aware or autism-friendly learning environments in our secondary schools and post-16 settings. If you enjoyed this video, please stick around and watch our video on useful daily and weekly activities that you can use to develop skills for learning in autistic students in secondary and post-16 settings. Also, don't forget to check out our resources page at the EPS Training Library, which features links to all the resources we mention here, plus examples of further training. First, let's start with a quick reminder of some of the best practice guidelines for supporting autistic young people in our settings. In particular, we want to provide visual learning environments, clear instructions, and predictable routines. So, what changes can we make to our classrooms to achieve this? Well, we can start by thinking about how we create highly visual learning environments. This means environments which use consistent visual symbols to label different areas in the classroom, to mark out hazards, to remind young people about the rules, and to prepare them for upcoming activities. One really important example of this is using visual timetables, which help students predict and remember the daily routines. Many autistic students find timetables which are color-coded for each lesson are easier to understand and remember. We can also use and display social stories, which are cartoon strip, picture-heavy stories that explain important rules and expectations, for example depicting how we ask for help when we need it, or the reasons behind and steps involved in personal hygiene routines. Social stories can be adapted to fit any situation in a young person's life. There are lots of pre-written social stories available online. There are also free online tools that we can use to create our own personalized social stories. Displaying these social stories on walls helps many autistic students learn and remember even better than hearing us repeat rules and expectations out loud. Secondly, we need to ensure that learning environments for autistic young people do not overwhelm their senses. Sensory processing difficulties are extremely common in people with social communication difficulties, and we need to avoid challenging their senses of sight, hearing, and touch with too many changes in the environment. Changes in lighting, unexpected noises, and unfamiliar textures often cause distractions, distress, and even a sense of physical pain for autistic children. And so, it's important that we reduce visual clutter on desks and walls wherever we can. Or we might even create a personal, clutter-free desk or workstation that autistic students can use during activities which don't require working in groups, but do require longer periods of concentration. Creating stores or drawers for finished and unfinished classwork also helps students with social communication difficulties monitor their progress through tasks. We also need to manage light and noise levels in our classrooms. This means trying to avoid flashing lights and unexpected noises, or at least pre-warning students about them happening. We might also consider providing resources which protect students' senses, like ear-defending headphones, which help them cope and concentrate during busier activities. Finally, there are lots of sensory checklists and sensory audit tools available online which help us review our learning space and consider changes that can ease the sensory processing demands they place on our young people. It's especially important that safe spaces for students, for example SEN bases or hubs, have an environment which do not overwhelm the senses if we want autistic students to actually use them. A third important aspect of creating autism-aware environments is to make them as predictable as possible. Young people with ASC are sometimes called mini-scientists, as they like their world to be predictable and repeatable. Increasing predictability often results in decreasing worry and anxiety. So wherever we can help autistic learners by establishing consistent daily routines and sticking to them. We can also help students move through these routines and make transitions by using predictable countdown tools, for example, digital countdowns on a whiteboard. We need to gradually encourage teenagers to take responsibility for monitoring the time independently, praising and rewarding them as they make progress. Of course, life, and especially life in schools and colleges, is not always predictable. So what we can also do is to help students learn to cope with changes to routines. A great way of doing this is to develop a visual system that indicates a change to usual routines, for example an OOPS card on a visual timetable. We might want to practice using this card for pleasurable changes at first. For example, oops, it's time to do something you enjoy, like using school computers or going outside, which can help students make positive associations with their routines being changed. The fourth and final example of an autism-aware environment we have for you is to create obvious environments. By this, we mean making our instructions, rules, boundaries, expectations, and rewards as clear and explicit and obvious as possible. We want to avoid giving instructions which require students to interpret or guess what we mean. This includes avoiding assumptions that the student will understand typical social norms or figures of speech by saying things like behave nicely or pull your socks up. For autistic students, it's much better to use simple and plain language. Rather than saying, we are against the clock, we could say, we have 5 minutes left before we finish. Wherever we can, we are trying to reduce the energy and effort that autistic learners spend on interpreting the language of our classroom. And this clarity is important in all aspects of an autistic student's experience of education, including how we communicate their timetable, rules, and rewards. We want the practices and standards of our school or college to be as clear and obvious as we can possibly make them. So, let's summarize by saying that when we use visual symbols alongside words and text, when we reduce distractions and unexpected sensory stimulation, when we make routines as predictable as possible, and when we make rules and expectations easy to understand, we are giving autistic students the best possible chance to understand, concentrate, and make progress in our secondary schools and post-16 settings. Thanks for listening, and I hope you found this video useful. If so, please check out the next video in this series, which covers useful activities to develop learning skills in secondary school and post-16 students with social communication difficulties.